Alright, so Apple finally launched its newest iPhone 14 and 14 Pro models, and they do come with a lot of new and upgraded hardware features at more expensive prices. With that said, if you're after a really affordable entry point to iOS, should you still buy the iPhone 11 in 2022? Let's take a look. Alright, so looking back at the iPhone 11, it was a pretty significant step up from the iPhone XR. You could say that it replaced the XR in Apple's lineup at the time, but it was a pretty successful iPhone in terms of sales, and a lot of people pretty much got it because of the reasonably affordable pricing at the time, and a design which incorporates Apple's full screen look to its devices. But the thing with new iPhone launches is that when the new models come out, the older models tend to get a price drop. With that said, Apple has adjusted the prices of its older models, and you can get the iPhone 12 and iPhone 13 for slightly lower prices, depending of course on where you are. One thing to note though is with this new batch of iPhones, Apple has finally removed the iPhone 11 from its online stores and presumably its physical stores as well, since it is an older model after all. And although you can't find the iPhone 11 anymore on Apple's website, there's no doubt that you can still find it on other online retailers or other carriers which still support the device. Now in 2022, does the iPhone 11 still maintain a good value proposition? Let's take a look. Alright, so first off, let's start with the physical design of the iPhone 11. At this point, it kind of crosses the threshold between old and new design, as you do get the signature Apple full screen design with the notch. And if you were to place it beside a bunch of newer iPhones, you probably couldn't tell the difference right away until you really take a closer look. And so for an older device, it still manages to get that quote-unquote modern Apple feel. But at the same time though, some people might feel that it is a dated hardware design at this point because of the round edges, the thick bezels, and of course we know that Apple has finally returned to giving us flat sides since the iPhone 12, 13, and even with the 14. And yeah, if you really nitpick the design details on the iPhone 11, you will definitely notice the slightly older look to it. With that said though, it still beats out the iPhone SE, which of course we know does come with a really older design. But yeah, it's slightly older compared to the new iPhones at this point, in which case if design is a particular factor for you, then you might want to take that into consideration. Alright, so moving on, let's talk about the display on the iPhone 11. Now it does have a 6.1-inch display, which Apple has maintained in its newer base model iPhones, but at this point it's really not too impressive anymore. It is of course stuck at 60 Hz. There's no ProMotion display on here, and the resolution is a bit lower compared to other phones in this price range. You can probably get more affordable Android phones with higher screen resolutions than this. And considering your price, you're stuck with an IPS LCD display, so it's not going to give you the best contrast and color vibrancy. If you are very particular about the quality of the display on your iPhone, then you might want to skip this. That is unless of course you can look past the low resolution and the lack of AMOLED, then the iPhone 11 might still be a decent choice for you. Now as for performance, the iPhone 11 does have Apple's older A13 Bionic chip, which at this point is 3 generations behind from the A16 obviously. But in general, I've had a pretty okay time using it. Like, it doesn't stutter, there's no terrible lag or freezes. I was able to run my games without any problem. Navigating through the user interface was pretty smooth overall. With that said though, looking from a purely performance-based standpoint, of course you're not going to get some newer iOS features with the A13, as it does have its limitations, but on its own the A13 is pretty good. I've even seen some benchmarks where the A13 almost catches up to the Google Tensor, which we know is a newer and more powerful chip. Now of course, comparing it to something like the A15 Bionic, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, it will have its shortcomings. But if you're just looking for basic performance without much hiccups, then the A13 is something to look at. With that said though, despite being an old iPhone, one of the advantages of getting an Apple device is that it does get support for several years or more. So iOS 16, for example, will still be compatible with the iPhone 11, and we can probably expect maybe 2 or even possibly 3 more years of software support for this one. And if you were to pick one today, I wouldn't be surprised if Apple does support this for even longer. Alright, so moving on, let's talk about the cameras. Of course, you do get a basic dual camera setup on this phone with the 12 megapixel main sensor. And yeah, it generally does take good photos, still more impressive than most cheaper Androids out there, but it will be missing features due to it being an older device. So stuff like Apple Cinematic Mode or one of their fancier new video modes won't make it in here. And there are even some camera features from the 13 and presumably the 14 which will not be available on the 11. But again, as with the display, as with the design, if you're not looking for anything fancy, then the camera on here should suit you. And the same can be said for battery. Like, the battery is still pretty good even today. If you can get one brand new, for example, on sale with 100% battery health, then it should last you for a couple more years. Or even if you can get one with less than 100%, generally, the iPhone 11 does have impressive battery life even back in its heyday. Right, so after all this, should you still get the iPhone 11 in 2022? With all the points that we discussed, it does make for one good phone on its own. You can get it for cheap, it does come with some pretty dependable features, but at this point, the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 13 are bound to be cheaper. You can probably get them in bargains or maybe slightly used, and they will come with a newer chip than the iPhone 11, they will come with a better display with slightly improved cameras, and of course a design that's more consistent with what Apple's been doing lately. And yes, while the iPhone 11 is still presumably getting support for the next couple of years, it is no longer available on Apple's website, so stuff like repairs and warranties are something to consider given the relative age of this device. So yeah, do I think it's worth it in 2022? If you're after a really affordable entry point to iOS with a design that looks a bit newer than the iPhone SE and with decent specs, then knock yourself out, get the 11. But just keep in mind that the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 13 will be subject to many deals and price drops, and there's something to take into consideration. Right guys, so that pretty much does it for this video. If you have your own thoughts on the iPhone 11, drop them down below. Are you still using one or do you plan to get one? Do check out our other videos. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.